time-lapse photography is basically taking a photo at set intervals, whether it's, every second or every minute or every hour over the course of time and showing, seeing the change. The goal would be to have a video that's, a decent length. And if you know frame rates for video, it needs to be, somewhere around 20 or 30 frames a second. It could be slower, but it gets choppy. And so if you need to fill a minute of time, that's 60 seconds times roughly, let's call it 20 frames. So you're talking 600 or 1,000 or even a couple thousand frames. So keep that in mind. It's always better to have quick intervals in frames. Yeah. All right. So a little background history of kind of film video photography. Is from Edward Muybridge, who made a bet with a California governor that a horse at some time in a gallop or in a race had all four hooves off the time. So this is his images, and this one here proves that all four hooves are off the ground. Some other people that have worked with time-lapse photography is this William Pfeiffer, who recorded plants as they grow. So a little information about it. You need to be able to record a time lapse. You need some sort of an intervalometer. Luckily, the best way to go these days is to just use your smartphone, because there are a lot of apps you can download to use that, or to do that. But if you wanted to use a camera, you definitely need a tripod and some sort of an intervalometer. And there's ones online that I've seen for like 50 or 60 bucks. I think there's some cheaper ones, but it's not a cheap tool to buy. And it really only has two purposes: one, to do the interval captures, or two, you can still use it as like a cable release for most of what I've seen. There are also internal intervalometers depending on your camera. And there are options to do like a tether capture, connecting a USB cable to a computer in order to have a computer trigger the camera at set intervals. Okay, so tripod, definitely important to keep your camera still pretty much for any of these, whether you're recording video or time lapse or stop motion animation. You're going to want to have something to stabilize the camera. And you can look up if your camera has the capabilities at dpreview.com. And it's this right here, whether it has it or not. So I don't remember. I think this is my camera that I looked up, and it doesn't. So this is what an intervalometer looks like. Energizer. I think they're 60 bucks at B&H. You can find other models cheaper other places. And then there are also these software applications, EOS Utility for Canon that supposedly does it. I haven't actually tried it. And there's ones that are specific to Nikon or only work with PCs or versus Mac, depending on what you have. But Canon and Nikon, you can usually find these sorts of things. And then I've got some cables available. If you don't have your original camera cable, we can try and coordinate for you to get it from me probably on a Friday, because that's usually when I'm able to get into campus. Things that are helpful to make a time lapse. Manual focus is very important, because if things are moving, your camera may or may, maybe it gets darker, maybe things are moving, it'll focus at different points. You want to have the focus remain constant and, not close and then far, and that sort. Drift spinner, these are fun. We used to have some of these, but they've all broken. But they basically spin the camera 360 degrees, which is nice if you're doing like a city view or something like that, and you want to have some motion. Neutral density filter can help make longer exposures, so you can kind of blur motion. If there are fast moving things like people and you want them to kind of disappear, or if you want to have like streaks of car lights, that can be kind of interesting. Usually a wide angle lens gives you, if you want a landscape, you get a great view that way. And then the really important thing, and what usually happens to students that kind of kills it, is if you run out of batteries. your camera, you won't take any pictures. So you could get, quarter or halfway through what you're planning, and then battery dies and you're in trouble. Same idea for memory card. You want to have a really big memory card and probably set your quality settings lower on your camera if you're going to do that. So JPEGs, always best, keeps quality compacted so you can capture more images on your memory card. White balancing first is always a good idea. You can always do it in post, but it's harder to do it on video. So manual aperture priority or shutter priority, depending on which one is necessary. I would usually try and keep my aperture settings constant, but in some cases you might want to try and keep your shutter speed constant. Resolution of the camera, I would actually bump it down from the highest quality to a sort of medium range. Make sure you're still getting at least screen resolution, but you don't need full print resolution for when you're doing a time lapse. And then some people like to do a crop of 16:9 because that's more cinematic. So that's an idea. And that's kind of the difference between, the red bar would be your normal 2:3 versus the white being just your 16:9. All right, some other things about how to make a time lapse. Good subjects. Well, there's a whole list here, but you can kind of check it out. But where there's action, basically, is what I would say. And depending on what you choose, they're going to be more fast moving versus slow moving, and you might want your frame rate to be faster or slower. So here's some suggested, I'm calling it frame rate, and I should call it your intervals. So things that are moving fast, 1 second apart. Things that are kind of a little bit more moderate, 1 to 3 seconds. Things that are really slow, 15 to 30 seconds. So think of this as like working at night or working with really, really slow things. Photographing a turtle crawling, something like that, Okay, so you need to do the math. You need somewhere between 350 and 1,000. I would say definitely more than 350. Realistically, 600 was kind of what I did on the math earlier. But 1,000 captures or more. So that means that if you're doing 1 second intervals, that's a 20-minute clip approximately. If you're doing 5 second intervals, it gets much longer. If you're doing 15-second intervals, that's days. So you really don't want to have 15-minute intervals. I probably wouldn't even do 1-minute intervals because your chances of running out of your batteries is so high. So 1 second, 5 second are probably good ideas, but it kind of depends on how much time you want to capture. So keep that in mind. All right. Other settings or settings for an actual intervalometer. They usually have these 4 settings. Delay is for how long it goes until it takes the first photograph. So you probably want a delay so that you don't have camera shake in the first frames, but maybe it's not as important. Long is the length in time in seconds that the camera should keep the shutter open. Depending on your camera, this may be something you can set versus not set. So it's like if you wanted to do a 2-second long exposure, it's not how far between the exposures, it's actually how long is that exposure. The interval is the space between. And then N for number is how many images it would actually take. So depending on the interval, they may or may not have all these options. And depending on whether you have it built into your camera, you may or may not have all those options. Okay, it's significant problems. So auto exposure will cause flicker, meaning that if you have like clouds passing, the camera will make the exposure compensate and make the whole overall scene brighter when a cloud comes by and causes a shadow. So it will look like the whole scene gets brighter, and then the whole scene gets darker, and the whole scene gets brighter, and the whole scene gets darker. So you don't want anything to be auto. You want it to be like locking in your manual exposure is really what I would suggest. So manual exposure is the best idea. Aperture priority or shutter priority. If lighting will change, it keeps it simpler for you, but it's possible that you'll have some flicker because it is still an auto, it's automatically picking your shutter speed, or it's automatically picking your aperture. So manual exposure is always best. Depth of field, think about that in advance. if you're doing a landscape, you probably want a large depth of field. Although if you want to get creative and you're up close to something, maybe shallow depth of field might be interesting. And then motion blur. Some people like that, some people don't. So that's controlling, depth of field's being controlled by your aperture, motion blur is being controlled by your shutter speed. So prioritize those. All right, and then some great examples. I'll probably just pull up one here. As always, this video is going to be way too long. So I'll pull this up. Actually, this one's pretty good. There we go. Make it full screen, and then we'll be able to see the whole thing. There we go. All right, I'm just going to play a little bit of this.